The badge Julian Reyes clipped to his shirt that first morning said nothing about who he was. That was the entire point of it. He owned 3 cardigans, all gray, and had chosen the plainest one on purpose. He carried a canvas bag instead of a briefcase. He had shaved off the small, deliberate grooming habits that made a man look like he came from money. Because at Voss Regional Health Network, looking like you came from money was the fastest way to be handed nothing real to do. Julian did not want to be handed nothing real to do. He wanted the floor. The supply logistics office sat in the basement level of the East Tower, 3 floors below the cafeteria, in a windowless room that smelled faintly of cardboard and floor cleaner. It was not glamorous work. Purchase orders, inventory counts, the endless small failures of a hospital system trying to keep bandages and IV bags and surgical trays where they needed to be, when they needed to be there. But it was the room where everything the hospital actually did pass through on its way to a patient. His grandfather had built Voss Regional from a single clinic in 1961. His father had expanded it into 11 facilities across 3 counties, and somewhere along the way, in a basement room nobody upstairs thought to visit, something had gone quietly wrong. Julian had heard about it in fragments. A whistleblower hotline complaint that dead-ended in review. A resignation letter that used the word environment 3 times without explaining what it meant. His father, in his study one evening, turning a glass of scotch slowly in his hand and saying that he trusted the numbers on paper less than he trusted what a person could see standing in a room. Julian had offered to go and stand in the room. His supervisor was a woman named Renata Cole, mid-50s, sharp-jawed, with the posture of someone who had once been overlooked in a much bigger room and had never forgotten it. She wore her authority the way some people wear a uniform they fought hard to earn carefully and without apology. On Julian's first morning, she looked him over for exactly as long as it took to form a judgment, handed him a stack of overdue inventory reconciliations, and told him the East Tower had been a mess since the last coordinator quit without notice. "Figure out why the numbers don't match," she said, "and don't come to me with problems. Come to me with answers." Julian said he understood. He sat down at the desk. She pointed him toward a desk with a chair that leaned slightly to the left and a monitor with a dead pixel in the corner, and got to work. The mismatch wasn't complicated. Someone had been logging surgical tray restocks against 2 different tracking codes, splitting what should have been a single entry across departments in a way that made theft look like clerical error, and made clerical error look like theft, depending on which direction you needed the story to go that week. It took Julian 4 hours to find the pattern and the rest of the day to trace it backward through 11 months of records. He noticed the room's geography before anyone told him what it meant. Renata sat at the far desk near the door, where she could see who came and went. Owen Hale sat closest to her, a broad, easy-laughing man in his 30s who called everyone champ and had a talent for finishing other people's sentences in meetings just before those people got credit for finishing them. And near the supply cage, quiet, precise, doing the work of 2 people, without being asked, sat a woman named Priya Anand. By his 3rd day, Julian understood that Priya was the actual engine of the department and that almost nobody above her knew it. He watched her build a reconciliation model from scratch on her lunch break, unpaid, because the old one kept producing errors that made the whole floor look incompetent. He watched Owen take that model into a Thursday meeting with the Deputy Director of Operations and present it as his own initiative without a flicker of hesitation, and he watched Renata nod along and later send an email praising Owen's leadership on the reconciliation issue to 3 people above her pay grade. Priya's name did not appear in the email. Priya did not react when she read it. She simply closed the message and kept working, the particular stillness of someone who had learned a long time ago exactly what happened to people who reacted. Julian filed that away. He was not in a hurry. Patience was not a virtue he'd had to cultivate. It was simply the only posture that let him see the floor as it actually was, rather than as it performed itself to be for the 15 minutes a week someone from upstairs walked through. There was a small ritual he kept without quite meaning to. Every morning, on his way down to the basement, He passed through the East Tower lobby, where a black-and-white photograph of the hospital's founding physician hung slightly crooked in its frame, his grandfather, 30 years old, standing in front of the original clinic building in 1961. Julian straightened it each time. He'd done it since childhood, at his father's side, long before this building had 11 wings and 4,000 employees. Nobody in the lobby ever seemed to notice a supply coordinator pausing for 3 seconds to nudge a frame 2 degrees to the left. By the end of his first week, Julian had cleared the inventory backlog Renata had handed him, cleanly, with documentation. He didn't announce it. He put the corrected reconciliation in the shared drive and moved on to the next stack. 2 days later, in a hallway outside the break room, he overheard Renata telling the deputy director that the East Tower's numbers had finally been sorted out thanks to Owen's oversight of the team. Owen, standing beside her, did not correct the record. He simply accepted the credit the way a man accepts a coat someone else is holding open for him. Julian kept walking. He did not slow down. He had learned, over years spent watching operations fail in places far from any executive floor, that the moment to act was never the moment you first saw the problem. It was the moment the pattern repeated itself enough times that no one could later claim it had been a misunderstanding. That moment was still weeks away. But something in the basement room had already noticed him, not for what he'd done, but for a small, strange detail nobody could quite place. On his second day, filling out a facilities request for a supply cage that needed rewiring, Julian had written the location using an old internal code, Wing C, Sub 2. It was the designation the East Tower had used before a renovation in 1987 renamed everything into the numbering system the hospital still used today. The facilities clerk who processed the form was new and didn't know the difference. But Sofia Delgado, the HR director, happened to see the request cross her desk on an unrelated matter that same afternoon and paused over it for a moment she couldn't explain to herself before setting it aside and moving on to the next file. She would think about that request again. Just not yet. The second week began with a smaller cruelty, the kind that never made it into any complaint file because it was never large enough on its own to be worth reporting. Julian arrived on Monday to find his desk chair replaced with one missing a wheel. Nobody had said anything to him about it. When he asked Owen mildly whether facilities had swapped the furniture, Owen laughed and said maybe Julian just didn't know how to sit in a chair right, champ. And the room laughed with him, the specific laughter of people relieved that the target that morning wasn't them. Julian sat down anyway. The chair wobbled every time he leaned forward. He worked through it without comment, and by mid-morning he'd stopped noticing. What he did notice was Priya, 3 desks away, watching the exchange with her jaw set in a way that told him she recognized the pattern before he did. She didn't say anything either. She went back to her screen, and Julian understood that her silence and his were not the same kind of silence. His was a choice made from a position of eventual power. Hers was a survival strategy built over years of having no power at all. He started staying later, not to prove anything, but because the evening hours were when the East Tower basement told the truth about itself. Renata left at 5 sharp most days, the confidence of someone who had long ago stopped worrying that anything might happen without her watching. Owen usually left with her, or shortly after. That left Julian and Priya, and sometimes a rotating cast of 2 or 3 others, finishing the real work of the day in the quiet after the performance of the day had ended. It was in one of those evenings that Priya finally spoke to him beyond what the job required. "You redid the tray reconciliation," she said, not looking up from her screen. "The one from Thursday. I noticed it needed doing. Owen's going to take credit for that too." She said it flatly, without bitterness, the way a person states a fact about weather. He always does. Renata lets him because it makes her job easier. If Owen looks good, she looks good for developing him. If I look good, she stopped herself. "If you look good?" Julian asked. Priya was quiet for a moment. It complicates the story she's been telling for 15 years, that she's the only one who really understands how this place runs, that nobody else could do what she does. She finally looked at him. You're new. You don't know how deep that story goes for her." Julian filed the sentence away carefully. It was the first real crack in the wall, the first piece of a fear he'd have to understand fully before he could do anything meaningful about it. He learned more of it 3 days later, second-hand, from a maintenance technician named Owen had once mocked in front of the whole floor for a scheduling error. The technician, cornered by Julian's genuine and uncalculated question about a supply routing problem, mentioned almost as an aside that Renata had come up through the ranks the hard way 20 years ago, before any of the current management had degrees past a high school diploma, back when supply logistics wasn't a department anyone with ambition wanted. She'd clawed her way into the room where budget decisions were made by being the only person who could recite, from memory, exactly how every wing of every building actually functioned. And then, the technician said, the hospital started hiring people with master's degrees for the jobs she'd built with her hands, and she watched 2 of them get promoted past her in 18 months. She doesn't trust competence she didn't personally train, the technician said. Especially not competence that doesn't need her permission to exist. Julian thanked him and went back downstairs. He didn't repeat any of it, but he understood, more precisely now, what he was standing in front of. Renata's cruelty wasn't random, and it wasn't really about Julian or Priya or anyone specific. It was about a woman who had built the only kind of authority available to her total operational indispensability, and who had learned, through hard experience, that anyone who threatened that indispensability had to be managed, diminished, or removed before they got the chance to make her obsolete. That didn't make what she was doing acceptable. It made it something he could work with. The blame started arriving at Julian's desk with more regularity after that. A miscount in the surgical supply cage, not his error. The log clearly showed the count had been submitted before his shift began, landed on his desk, with his name attached by the time it reached the deputy director's inbox. He corrected the record calmly, without escalating it, and watched Renata's expression flicker with something like recalibration when the correction held up. She had expected him to either not notice or not push back. He'd done a quiet, precise version of both. Requests started arriving at 4:45 inches the afternoon with deadlines of 8 the next morning, always missing some piece of context he needed to complete them cleanly, always with enough ambiguity built in that a stumble could be pinned on him later if it served someone. Julian met every deadline anyway. He'd learned, in years of consulting in places far harder than a hospital basement, that the fastest way to defuse a trap built on your incompetence was to simply never be incompetent, however inconvenient that made things for the people who needed you to be. The floor noticed. Nobody said anything, but there was a shift in the air by the second week, a new coordinator who didn't rattle, who didn't perform frustration or panic for anyone's benefit, who fixed things quietly and moved on. Renata began finding reasons to walk past his desk more often, watching without appearing to watch. He recognized the behavior. It was the same behavior he'd catalogued in every organization he'd ever studied that had begun, without fully admitting it to itself, to feel threatened by someone new. Priya's public correction came on a Wednesday. She had submitted a restock order for the trauma bay with a single transposed digit, a 2 where a 7 should have been, the kind of typo any exhausted person makes at the end of a 14-hour week. Renata caught it in a floor-wide status meeting, 20 people in the room, and did not correct it quietly. She read the error aloud, then read it again, slower, for emphasis, and asked Priya in front of everyone whether she understood the consequences of miscounting trauma bay supplies, whether she understood that this was not a department where sloppiness was acceptable, whether 6 years at Voss Regional had taught her nothing about the weight of the work. Priya sat very still. Her face did not change. She said yes. She understood. She would correct it immediately. Julian watched the moment happen from across the room, and he watched what happened after it. Too, the way Priya's hands stayed perfectly steady on her keyboard for the next 20 minutes, the way she did not look at anyone, the way she left for the bathroom exactly 4 minutes after the meeting ended, and returned exactly 6 minutes after that, with her composure fully rebuilt, as though nothing had happened at all. He understood that this was not the first time. It was simply the most recent time he had personally witnessed. He also watched a second thing, smaller, that he almost missed. A young supply technician named Marcus, new to the floor, had opened his mouth slightly when Renata began the second read-through of the error. The specific half-second of a person about to object, and then closed it again, glancing sideways at Owen, at the door, at the 6 months left on his probationary contract, before going back to his screen. Julian didn't blame him for it. He simply noted it, the way he noted everything, and understood exactly what it cost a person in this room to stay employed and quiet at the same time. That evening, after the floor had emptied, Julian stayed late again. He pulled up 4 years of the East Tower's internal performance evaluation records access he technically had, buried in a permissions tier. Nobody had thought to restrict from a supply coordinator because nobody imagined a supply coordinator would think to look. What he found confirmed what the maintenance technician had told him and went further than he expected. 3 formal complaints had been filed against the department's management culture over the past 4 years. All 3 had been reviewed by Renata herself, in her capacity as team lead, and closed as unsubstantiated within days. 2 of the complainants no longer worked at Voss Regional. Julian didn't recognize either name yet. He would, soon enough. He closed the file at 11 that night and sat for a moment in the empty basement room, the hum of the building's ventilation the only sound. He thought about what his father had told him once, standing in that study, with the scotch turning slowly in his hand, that a hospital could have the best surgeons in the state and still fail the people who worked inside it, floor by floor, quietly, if nobody with real power ever bothered to look down long enough to see it happening. Julian had come here to look. He was starting to understand that looking wasn't going to be enough. Eventually, someone was going to have to act, and the record was going to have to be strong enough that acting couldn't be dismissed as overreach or favoritism or the impulsive decision of someone who didn't yet understand how the department really worked. He wasn't ready yet. He needed more. He locked the file, gathered his bag, and took the stairwell up instead of the elevator. The way he did most nights, it let him pass through the East Tower lobby on his way out. The lobby was empty at that hour except for a security guard reading something on his phone near the front desk. The founding physician's photograph hung on the far wall, slightly crooked again, the way it always seemed to drift by the end of a week, no matter how carefully it was hung. Julian crossed the lobby and straightened it, the same small motion he made without thinking. 2 fingers on the frame, a half-degree correction. He didn't notice the security guard glance up at him for a moment longer than the gesture warranted. He didn't notice, either, that the guard had worked at Voss Regional for 11 years, long enough to have seen exactly one other person straighten that frame with that exact motion, at that exact angle. A man who used to visit the East Tower decades ago, before the building had his family's name on a plaque nobody in the basement ever read closely enough to recognize. The guard went back to his phone. It wasn't his business. But it was the kind of detail that, once seen, doesn't fully leave a person's memory. It would surface again later, at exactly the moment it mattered most. The accusation came on a Tuesday morning, delivered with the particular efficiency of something that had been planned rather than discovered. Julian arrived to find Sofia Delgado already in the basement room, standing beside Renata's desk with a folder open in front of her. Owen sat nearby with the stillness of a man who already knew how the scene would end. Priya was at her desk, not looking up, her hands motionless on her keyboard in a way Julian had learned to read as a person bracing for something. Sofia asked Julian to step into the small conference room off the supply cage. Her expression carried the practiced neutrality of someone delivering news she hadn't written herself. She told him that an internal audit had flagged a discrepancy in the trauma bay's controlled inventory, a quantity of surgical supplies logged as received but never accounted for in the dispensing records, worth several $1,000s, traced through the system to credentials issued under his employee login. She said the pattern had been flagged over the past 10 days. She said, without quite meeting his eyes, that given the sensitivity of controlled medical inventory, the hospital's position was that they could not continue his employment while the matter was under review. Julian asked to see the audit trail. Sophia looked at Renata. Renata said the documentation was being handled by compliance and wasn't available for him to review at this stage. Julian asked whether there was a process for contesting the decision before it took effect. Sophia said that given the nature of the flag, the separation was effective immediately. Standard protocol for anything touching controlled inventory. She slid a single sheet across the table and asked him to sign it, acknowledging the termination. Julian looked at the page for a long moment. Then he signed it. He asked for a copy. Sophia gave him one. He thanked her, and his voice was even unhurried. Entirely without the reaction the room seemed to be braced for. He walked back into the main room to collect his things. The floor had gone quiet in the specific way a room goes quiet when everyone is watching without appearing to watch. He put his mug, his charger, and a single folder of notes into the small box someone had already, tellingly, left beside his desk. Priya's hands were still on her keyboard. He saw her jaw tighten, saw the half-second where her chair shifted an inch, as though her body had started to stand before her mind stopped it. She didn't say anything. Julian didn't expect her to. He understood exactly what 6 years in that room had taught her about the cost of a single sentence spoken at the wrong moment, and he did not judge the silence, because judging it would have meant pretending he didn't know precisely how it had been built. He carried the box through the basement corridor, up the stairwell instead of the elevator, and into the East Tower lobby for what he assumed, in that moment, might be the last time. The lobby was busier at that hour than it had been on any of his late nights. Visitors, staff changing shifts, a cluster of people near the information desk. Julian crossed toward the exit and, from habit, from emotion so old it lived in his hands rather than his thoughts, set the box down for a moment on the ledge beneath the founding physician's photograph and reached up to straighten the frame. That was when a voice behind him said carefully, "You always do that." Julian turned. An older man stood a few feet away, silver-haired, dressed in a coat too formal for a Tuesday morning hospital visit, holding a folder of his own. Julian didn't recognize him, but something in the way the man was looking at him, not at his face, but at his wrist, where his sleeve had ridden up slightly when he reached for the frame, made the moment stretch longer than it should have. The man's eyes had found the watch. Old steel, scratched glass, a strap gone soft with wear, and on the back of the case, worn nearly smooth by decades of handling but still faintly legible if you knew to look, 3 engraved initials that matched a name etched into a cornerstone on the far side of the building, a name that had not walked through this lobby as an employee in longer than most of the staff currently working there had been alive. The man did not say anything else. He simply stood there, very still, his folder forgotten at his side, staring at a supply coordinator who had just been walked out of the building for stealing surgical inventory, wearing a watch that should not have existed anywhere except in an old photograph in the hospital's own archive room, a photograph of a founding board member's son, taken at a ribbon cutting in 1988, wearing that exact watch on that exact wrist. Julian picked up his box. He held the man's gaze for one more second, said nothing, and walked out through the glass doors into the morning light. Behind him, the man was already reaching for his phone. The man in the lobby was Walter Ainsley, 78 years old, a retired board member who had sat on Voss Regional's founding committee for 30 years before stepping back from active involvement. He had not set foot in the East Tower in nearly 2 years. He had come that morning only to drop off a donation folder for the hospital's archive project, a small errand he'd almost sent by courier instead. He did not call security. He called Sofia Delgado directly, a number he still had from his years on the board, and he asked her, without preamble, whether she knew whose watch the man she'd just terminated had been wearing. Sofia did not understand the question. Walter told her to pull the archive photograph from the 1988 East Tower ribbon cutting, the one with the founder's son standing beside his father in front of the new wing. He told her to look at the boy's wrist. Then he told her, more quietly, that the man who had just walked out of her building carrying a cardboard box looked enough like that boy grown older that he'd nearly said the father's name out loud before he caught himself. Sophia pulled the photograph in her office 11 minutes later. She sat with it open on her screen for a long time before she did anything else. She thought, first, of the facility's request from 3 weeks earlier. Wing C, Sub 2, a designation retired in 1987, a full year before she'd started at Voss Regional, one she'd only recognized because she'd once helped digitize the old facility's archive as an intern, and the phrase had stuck in her memory the way strange, useless facts sometimes do. She had noticed it then, and set it aside as a fluke. A new hire who'd copied an old label off some outdated internal wiki. She thought, next, of the gesture in the lobby, the frame straightened, the same small motion, twice a week for 3 weeks, so habitual it had never once looked performed. She thought of the security guard's odd half-second pause the week before, which she'd noticed only in passing and hadn't understood until now. None of it, alone, would have meant anything. Together, in the space of 11 minutes, it meant everything. She called Martin Cole, the general counsel, and asked him a single question. Was there any possibility, any at all, that the hospital's ownership family had someone working inside the East Tower under a different name? The silence on the line before Martin answered told her most of what she needed to know. Within the hour, the truth moved through the hospital's executive floor the way water moves through a crack. It has been quietly widening for weeks, not with force, but with the sudden, total completeness of something that had already been 90% in place and only needed one more piece to finish the picture. Martin confirmed to Sophia what the family had asked him to keep confidential. Julian Voss, son of the hospital system's chairman, grandson of its founder, had spent the last 3 weeks on the East Tower floor under the name Reyes, at his own request, to understand the department from the inside before stepping into a formal leadership role his father had been preparing him for over the past 2 years. Sophia sat with that for a long moment, and then she did something that would matter more than she understood at the time. She did not wait to be told what to do next. She pulled the Trauma Bay inventory audit herself, the one used to justify Julian's termination that morning, and read it line by line. It took her 40 minutes to find what should have taken the compliance team days if they had ever actually looked. It had originated from a shared terminal in the supply cage, logged in under his credentials at a time when the building's badge records showed he had not yet arrived that morning. The terminal in question was the one Owen Hale used most mornings to review overnight deliveries before anyone else was in. Sophia called Martin back with what she'd found. Martin called Julian's father. Within 90 minutes, the legal team had a formal hold on every East Tower record going back 4 years, and a courier was already on the way to Julian's apartment with a single request: would he come back to the hospital? Not as Reyes, but as himself, to review what they'd found. Julian was standing in his kitchen, the cardboard box still on the counter where he'd set it that morning, when the call came. He listened without interrupting. When Sophia finished, he asked her one question: whether Priya Anand had been informed of anything yet. Sophia said no. Julian said that was the right call, and that he'd be there within the hour. He arrived through the front entrance this time, not the basement stairwell, wearing the same gray cardigan he'd worn every day for 3 weeks. Sophia met him in the lobby, near the founding physician's photograph, and for a moment neither of them said anything. She looked at the frame, still perfectly straight from that morning, and then at him. "I should have caught it on day 1, she said. "Wing C sub 2. I knew that code. I just didn't let myself believe what it meant." "You caught it eventually," Julian said. "That's the part that matters." They went up together. Martin was waiting with the preliminary findings, and Julian read through them the way he read through everything, slowly, completely, without reacting until he understood the whole shape of it. The terminal logs, the badge records, the pattern of misattributed credit stretching back further than his own 3 weeks on the floor. 3 prior complaints, closed by Renata herself, 2 of them from employees who no longer worked at Voss Regional. A settlement paid quietly to one of them 18 months ago, buried in a budget line no one outside HR had ever had reason to examine. He closed the folder and looked out at the city through the executive floor windows. The same city Renata Cole had spent 20 years learning to run supply lines through from a windowless room 3 floors below street level. "I don't want this handled as a scandal," he said finally. "I want it handled as a correction. There's a difference. And the difference is going to matter to the people still on that floor tomorrow morning." Martin asked what that meant in practice. Julian told him. The termination of Renata Cole and Owen Hale would proceed. Documented specifically, not vaguely, every employee affected would receive a written account of exactly what had been found and why it mattered, not a generic separation notice designed to protect the hospital rather than inform the people who'd lived through it. The 2 former employees whose complaints had been closed without real investigation would be contacted directly, this week, by Sophia herself. Not by legal counsel first. And Priya Anand, whose unpaid, uncredited work had held the department together for 6 years while men with less competence and more comfort took the credit for it, would be the first person told before the announcement went to anyone else, and would be told by Julian, in person, exactly what had actually happened and what was going to change. Martin made notes and didn't ask unnecessary questions. Sophia, watching from across the table, understood that she was looking at the difference between a man who had waited 3 weeks to prove a point and a man who had waited 3 weeks because the truth only mattered if it held up under exactly this kind of pressure, evidence strong enough that no one could later call it favoritism or overreach or the impulsive decision of an owner's son who hadn't earned the right to make it. It was nearly 6 in the evening by the time Julian went down to the basement floor alone. Priya was still at her desk. She looked up when she heard him on the stairs, and for a moment her face did the thing it always did when she expected bad news, that careful, practiced stillness. Then she saw his expression, and the stillness shifted into something less certain, less prepared. "They called me an hour ago," she said slowly. "Told me to wait for someone before I left. I didn't think it would be you." Julian pulled out the chair across from her Marcus's empty chair, the young technician who'd gone home hours ago, and sat down. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to hear all of it before you decide how you feel about it." Julian told her everything. His name, his family, the 3 weeks, the reasons for them, the audit, the terminal logs, the truth about the trauma bay discrepancy that had ended his employment that morning and would end Renata's and Owen's by the end of the week. He told her about the 3 prior complaints, closed without real review, and the settlement buried in a budget line. He told her, last, that none of what she'd endured for 6 years had been invisible. It had simply never reached anyone with the power to act on it, until now. Priya sat with all of it for a long time before she said anything. When she finally spoke, it wasn't about Renata or Owen or the 6 years of stolen credit. It was smaller than that, and it told Julian more than a larger reaction would have. "I used to double-check my own work 3 times before I submitted anything," she said. "Not because I doubted myself, because I knew if there was ever a mistake, no one was going to give me the benefit of the doubt." She looked at him. "Is that going to be different now?" Julian said yes. He said the evaluation system that had governed the East Tower for years was being suspended immediately, and every record touched by Renata's tenure would be reviewed by an independent team before it was used for anything again. He said the reconciliation model she'd built on her own lunch breaks, the one Owen had presented as his initiative, would be formally credited to her, retroactively, in writing. He said he wanted her to lead the department's rebuild, not because it was owed to her as compensation, but because she was, by a wide margin, the most competent person who had ever worked that floor. Priya didn't answer right away. She looked down at her hands, then back up at him, and something in her face released, slowly, the way something releases after being held tight for far longer than anyone should have to hold it. The terminations were finalized by Thursday. Renata Cole and Owen Hale received documentation specific enough that neither could later claim the decision had been arbitrary. Renata did not call to explain herself. She sent a single email to Julian, 3 lines long, arguing that she had built the department's operational backbone over 20 years and that none of it would have functioned without her. Julian read it twice. He did not think it was entirely wrong. He also did not think it changed anything about what she had done to the people who worked under her, and he told her so, briefly, in his reply. He did not hear from her again. The 2 former employees whose complaints had been closed without real investigation were contacted that same week by Sophia, in person where possible. One of them, a former inventory analyst named Grace Okafor, had left Voss Regional 2 years earlier and taken a position at a much smaller clinic across the county, a job with less pay and a longer commute, but one where, she told Sophia over coffee, nobody had ever made her feel like her competence was a threat to someone else's story about themselves. She agreed to a settlement review. She did not agree to come back. Julian understood that, and did not push. Marcus, the young technician who had opened his mouth in that meeting and then closed it again, kept his job, and, 6 months later, would be the one to propose the department's new reporting channel, a direct line to HR and legal that bypassed team leadership entirely, built specifically so that no one on that floor would ever again have to calculate what a single sentence might cost them. Julian moved his desk out of the basement the following month, but not far, a small office on the 2nd floor of the East Tower, close enough to the supply cage that he could still walk down in 10 minutes if something needed his attention in person. He kept the cardboard box on the corner of the new desk for a while. The mug, the charger, the folder, before eventually putting them away in a drawer. He did not need them as a reminder anymore. He had stopped needing to prove to himself that the 3 weeks had been real. On his last morning walking through the East Tower lobby as a supply coordinator who no longer had to hide his name, he passed the founding physician's photograph, slightly crooked again, the way it always drifted by the end of a week. He straightened it out of habit. The same 2 fingers. The same half-degree correction. This time, when he looked up, Sophia was standing a few feet away, waiting for him, and she didn't look away from the gesture the way she used to. She just smiled, faintly, and fell into step beside him as they walked toward the elevator together. I keep thinking about the frame in that lobby, how many weeks Julian straightened it before anyone actually saw him do it. Not the watch, not the name, just a man quietly fixing something small because it mattered to him, long before anyone knew who he was. Have you ever worked somewhere that only started treating your work seriously once your name or title changed, even though the work itself never did? If this one stayed with you, I'd love to hear about the Priya in your own workplace down in the comments, the person who held everything together and never got the credit for it.